Hi, my name is Allison Moon. I'm a sex educator and author of Girl Sex 101 and Getting It, a guide to hot, healthy hookups and shame-free sex.
Okay, awesome. So I guess let's just start with like the Cliff's Notes of what brought you to this work and your experience.
Oh gosh, well, I was always the sex kid, right? I was the kid that my friends came to with questions about sex. My father was a nurse, and so he taught my sister and I all the right parts for things and all the right words for things. And so I became this little oracle in my Catholic elementary school, and I liked that, so I just kept on doing it.
And then what was your adult career journey in this space?
I started studying neuroscience as an undergraduate. I really wanted to become a brain researcher.
Oh,
And unfortunately, I let that go ultimately because of just the nature of the work. Dissecting rats for the rest of my life wasn't in
oh,
my career plans. But at the same time, I still kept this appreciation for just the neurology of sexuality and,
wow.
our emotions tied to our bodies and all of just the complications therein. So for me, sexuality just continued to stick around as this topic I was interested in, both as the just purely like meat based physicality of it, all the way up to these kind of exalted higher forms of sensuality and spirituality that can be tied into sex.
Cool. Okay. So I feel like we could do a million episodes. You have so much like knowledge in this space, but I want to talk about two of your books. So first, let's talk about Girl Sex 101, about sex between women. So give us like the TLDR premise of that book.
Well, ultimately, it's a book for queer women about how to have sex with queer women. It was a book that I didn't really see that existing. There were books about lesbian sexuality, but they tended to be very dense and very encyclopedic. And I
Uh-huh.
wanted a book that was really easy to read, very accessible, not scary, trans inclusive, and that kind of just acknowledged that your identity might not be lesbian, but you still might want to know how to have sex with women. And so for me, that was my jumping off point. It was the book that I created for the baby dyke that I was when I was coming out at 16 years old. And so it's filled with a lot of information about technique, relationships, how to flirt, how to not be creepy, and also just like strap-ons, anal sex, all the nitty gritty.
And great pictures. So let's talk about hand stuff. Give us a little tip. This is a short episode, but let's talk a little tips about how to do that well.
Well, I think ultimately it's acknowledging that hands are so incredibly malleable that ultimately a lot of us, regardless of who our sex partners are and what our orientation are, like hands are on the table for a while around sexuality as we're just getting to be sexual. But for a lot of heterosexual people, they kind of go away once
Mm-hmm.
PV comes on
Mm-hmm.
the scene. And that made me so sad when I realized that, like, I like having sex with men too, and hands weren't always involved.
Yeah.
But hands are so useful around sexuality. And so, again, regardless of your orientation or what you're packing in your panties, hands are something you really want to focus your energy on because they can be girthy, they can be narrow, they can be soft, they can be strong, they can be scratchy, they can be velvety. Like, there's so many different things you can do with your hands. And so, just acknowledging like the different sensations you can create, but also acknowledging that, like, pressure is really important in terms of
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, particularly for people with vulvas, because it's true for people with vulvas or penises that, like, ultimately a lot of our erectile tissue responds well to pressure. And so when you touch a vulva, being very deliberate about your touch, being that's why understanding anatomy is so important. So you know where you're touching and when and why to create certain sensations, acknowledging that, like, maybe your partner's clitoris is very, very sensitive. So you don't touch the glands of their clitoris, you touch around their clitoris. Or even just using a flat palm that your partner can grind against
Mm-hmm.
is so useful and so sexy. And then also just thinking about, like, I always say penetrate with permission. Check in before you put a finger inside somebody's body. That's
Yeah.
just polite. I also think it helps, like, undo a lot of the damage that we've done in our society around, like, people with vaginas just feeling like we're just receptacles that people
Yep.
put stuff inside. So asking permission. But one of the big takeaways from this too is not just about, because it's polite, but it's also because it's a sensation thing. Some people really love mixing clitoral stimulation with penetration. Like, if
Mm.
you slip a finger in at the right moment while you're eating them out, oh my God, rocket ship to the moon. Other people, it's like mixing peas and mashed potatoes. It's like, no, these are two different things. They shall not touch. And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, that like it's the reason why you ask for permission, because then you're listening to the partner and what they want, not just using autopilot to determine what you think that they want. So those are kind of some general tips around hand stuff, and we could talk all day about this.
Yeah, I first reached out to you because I wanted you to give like a mini fisting
uh,
tutorial. Say you're new to fisting and it sounds kind of a lot like a lot. What would you tell people about how to get started and maybe some do's and don'ts?
Sure. Yeah. So for me, fisting is really just advanced fingering, right? People, they hear the word fisting and they think you go in fist first, and that is
Right.
not at all the case. It's really just the experience that a lot of us have had of like, would you like me to add a finger? Yes, please. You add a finger. Would you like
Mhm.
me to add a finger? Yes, please. Add a finger. And then you're kind of running out of fingers, right? Like that's usually how fisting happens, is when you kind of notice that they can take more, or your partner wants more, you want more, but you don't have any more to give. And that's when the palm of your hand becomes the girth that you're looking for. So really it's just, again, making sure that your partner, or again, the recipient of the fisting, is very lubricated, very aroused, feeling capacious, and asking before you add any girth, because sometimes it can feel like there's a lot of room in there from the giving side, but it's actually very tight for the receiver. And sometimes it can feel the opposite. Sometimes you're like, oh
Mhm.
my God, they can't possibly take any more. And they're like, nope, keep going. And you're like, oh crap, okay. so so asking and really getting clarity, and then go super, super slow, especially if
Mhm.
it's your first time. Be okay with not getting there all in the first time. It is
Mhm.
often something people have to kind of practice, unless sometimes it happens spontaneously for people who've like given birth, right? Where they've
Mhm.
already had the experience of a massive amount of girth moving through their vagina. But for a lot of us who haven't, it takes some time. And really just focusing on like narrowing your hand to the best of your ability, kind of making a little what I call arrowhead of love, where you really like tuck your fingers as narrow as possible. And then just acknowledge that the first hardest part is always going to be that first part of your knuckles, right? Where your knuckles
Mhm.
meet your, or the knuckles on your palm, because there's not a lot of flexibility there from most people. And so that's where you kind of have to like really go slow, check in, add lube, and work your way in slowly. I also recommend always using gloves for this kind of sex, because they hold lube better. So
Oh.
skin to skin is a lovely experience, and I totally, if you're at that place, it's great. But for the first couple times you do it, using latex or non-latex gloves, because they are shiny where they're lubricated, so you can see at a
Uh-huh.
glance where there might be some friction points. And because they hold on to lube better, you don't have to constantly reapply, and they just tend to kind of take a little bit of that extra friction away, which can really help smooth things.
Oh, that's a good tip. It's like a condom kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that like wrong idea people have about the image of the fist is kind of where things can go wrong, right? Because you definitely don't want to go in with your, fingers splayed
Yeah, and that's, I mean,
incorrectly.
so the way that the word fisting comes around is because you do end up getting your fist inside, but for some people will stop kind of where you have the whole of your hand inside. But
Mhm.
because the vagina is a cul-de-sac, right? There is a top to it. What naturally often happens once you have most of your hand in is that your hand will slip inside and your fingers will naturally curl over, and you will have accidentally made a fist because of the size and the length of the vagina, not because you're going in fist first, but because in order to be kind of pulled in completely, that's the way that your hand will naturally shape itself.
Right on. Okay, so we'll leave the girl sex 101 on mouth stuff. And this again applies to kind of all different machinations of partners too. So, what's your like top tips for mouth stuff?
Again, like getting to know anatomy, really like studying anatomy. I'd say exploring sex with a little bit more light in the room. Oftentimes, with cunnilingus specifically, like you'll often be going underneath covers in a dark room. And so you really are flying blind. To the degree you can, especially with a new partner, kind of see the lay of the land is actually really helpful. So you just kind of get a sense of where everything is. And then acknowledge that different people like different sensations. And this is, again, even if you have all the same body parts. My girlfriend and I, like, we have all the same parts, but oh my gosh, the way we like stimulation is so different. Like, I'm the kind of
Mm.
person where you can like put a jackhammer on my clit and like, yeah, that's fine.
Me too.
But my partner, yeah, exactly. And like my partner is just like, if you look at her clit the wrong way, it'll just buzz her brain out. So it's like, okay, so understanding that, like, some people like direct clitoral stimulation, some people like kind of generalized, kind of clitoral kind of shaft stimulation,
Mm.
and get to know that. And one little tip that I often use is how a person likes their nipples played with sometimes will give you a good clue as to how they like their clit played with. So for people who are very
Oh.
like wired very sensitively, if they're like, my nipples are like, it's sending buzzy sensations throughout my body, that is usually a good indicator that their clit might be the same way. And again, everybody's different, but this is something I've just noticed anecdotally in having sex with a bunch of different women,
Makes
that
sense.
tends to give you a little bit of a clue in terms of just like their neurological wiring. But again, like, I'd say focus on the vulva in general, focus on all the external parts, the outer lips, the inner lips, the shaft of the clit, the opening to the vagina, and really give that whole area a lot of love when you're exploring cunnilingus. Don't just go straight for the clit right away, because even if that person likes direct clitoral stimulation, that can sometimes just be too much too soon. You
Hmm.
really want the whole vulva to get aroused and wake up and really feel good and yummy. And then you can start exploring, as you get closer to the clit, how their body responds. And again, it's hard. Like, again, as a person who performs cunnilingus, like, I acknowledge it can be a very difficult but very rewarding thing to do. But it requires not only to understand the vulva, but to listen to your partner
Hmm.
in general in a lot of ways, while you're also focusing on your tongue and your mouth, right? So listening to how their body's moving, just looking, like, glancing at their face, making sure that everything looks good and that everybody's on board, because you're trying to basically take in as much information as possible through kind of non-verbal ways, oftentimes through sound, through just body heat, through the way that they move their hips. And you're tracking it all at once, which can be very exciting, but also kind of overwhelming if you're not used to that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Anything else? I guess let's leave this section on, is there anything kind of more on the relationship side for Girl Sex 101 that you think is really important for people to keep in mind as they explore these relationships?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately, where I get a lot of pushback from my book is people gatekeeping identities. And I think something I've just noticed as I've gotten older, even with like younger generations, like, a lot of people are very afraid to identify in different ways, or are
Mhm.
very afraid to explore things that they might not be sure they're ready for a label with yet. And
Mhm.
I just want to say, like, this is always going to be a journey for everyone. Like, I'm 41 years old and I'm still learning about my sexuality in new ways. And to give yourself permission to be a beginner, and to give yourself permission to not know the answers, just because, again, you have all the same parts, does not mean that you know how your partner works, right? And so it's okay to have a beginner's mind and to try things on. And so that can be a thing about, queer sex. It's like, you might not know what you want, but reading the book might be a way for you to get a sense of, okay, this is something I definitely want to pursue, or this is something that's probably not for me.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the identity thing too. I mean, I have not yet had girl sex, but I'm 39 and I'm not counting myself out.
Yeah, exactly. Life is a journey.
Yeah.